Eamonn McEneaney, he's waiting patiently on the line to take us on another whistle-stop tour of Waterford treasures. Good morning, Eamonn.
Well, Eamonn, how are you?
Good morning, Ollie. Good morning, listeners.
Now, Eamonn, Waterford and the Napoleon connection, and there's a big one.
There is a huge one, yeah. As everybody knows, Napoleon was one of the greatest generals in history, and Waterford has a connection with Napoleon Bonaparte. As everyone knows, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1814, and he died in exile. Of course, they wouldn't execute a leader, so he died in exile in 1821 on the island of St. Helena in South Atlantic, keeping him away from Europe as far as possible so they wouldn't start any more trouble. Waterford has connection through the Wyse family, and of course people know the Manor of St. John in Lisduggan, and Manor Street and Manor Hill, of course Bunkers Hill, are all named because of the manor. The original manor of the family was in Bunkers Hill, and then they moved to Lisduggan.
Very interesting. That's where the name came from.
That's where they came from. In Manor Lawn as well is part of all. The name lives on there in that. Thomas was fairly wealthy. He wasn't very wealthy, but he's fairly wealthy, and he did as a lot of young men did in the 1820s. They went off on a grand tour of Europe, and while he was on a grand tour of Europe, of course, you get introductions. You wouldn't stay in hotels or kind of doss houses, and he got an introduction to Napoleon's sister, Pauline, the very beautiful Pauline. There's a wonderful sculpture of her by a very famous sculptor in Rome. It's called the Venus of the Bonapartes, which was so beautiful, and she was depicted as the goddess Venus. And then she introduced him to her brother Lucian, and Lucian had two daughters. There were two daughters who were very let us say that they liked to be entertained, and they liked to live the high life, and he had already married off one, so he was determined to marry off the other. So Thomas was the innocent abroad, and he married Laetitia Bonaparte, a very, very beautiful woman, and they didn't get on well at all from the beginning. They had their first son who was called Napoleon, of course after his uncle. She was the niece of Napoleon Bonaparte. They had one son. The marriage started to split up. He had her committed to a convent by order of the Vatican. Then he decided he'd hightail it back to Waterford without her and take the son with him, and the family stopped him, so he was forced to take the son back. And then she was pregnant with the second son, and they came back here to Waterford, and they lived in what we now know as the Manor of St. John there in Lisduggan. He then spent all of his time involved in Catholic emancipation and with Villiers Stewart and the election of that, and really the marriage went downhill all the time, and he wasn't maybe the most supportive of men. He had his two children, his two sons, sent off to private schools and taken them away from her because he maintained she was filling their heads with nonsense about the importance of the Bonaparte family and about her own beauty. And as the marriage broke down, then she went off to London. In London she met an army officer, but we now think that army officer was a cover for the Duke of Buckingham, and had three further children, two daughters, very beautiful daughters, and another son. The marriage, as I said, had broken down at this stage. Then she decided she was living there. Her husband then, she tried to of course get maintenance from the husband, and he was refusing that, and he was trying to get out of it, and he then started to object to her. When the children were old enough to get married, she had them in France at this stage, and she'd married them off to important people, and she'd forged his signature on the marriage certificate.
Wow.
And one of the really important things we have in the museum is a cross that her grandmother had made, that had been Napoleon's mother had made, and she commissioned 12 of these from a Paris jeweller, and that cross is the only one of 12 that now survive.
Wow.
And was made specifically for the ladies of the family to mourn the death of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. So we also have a lock of Napoleon's mother's hair and a lock of Napoleon's hair also, because these were people in those times were very sentimental. So as I said, it's a huge long story, so I'm trying to cut it short as well. As I said, then the marriage broke down. He went off to become ambassador to Greece. He used to try and sue her for the fact that he would forward his name on marriage registers, because in France you had to have the father's name on the marriage register. And by this stage, of course, her first cousin was now president of France, of the French Republic, Louis Bonaparte, and he then became the Emperor of France. But he, in fact, didn't get on well with her either, and he used to write in his diary like that it's easier to rule France than it is to rule my family. And he used to pay Thomas Wyse money not to sue her because he didn't want any more scandals. So the whole thing kind of got out of control. But anyway, look, in the end of the day, he died in Greece. He got a royal funeral in Greece. Of course, he couldn't be brought back to Ireland. As British ambassador to Greece, he got a royal funeral there. And then he, of course, disinherited his 5 children. She came back to Ireland and contested the will, and then decided to live at the Manor of St. John with her son, Napo, they used to call him Napoleon, to really cheese Thomas off. He was dead, of course, at this stage, but really cheese him off. She got a local sculptor called Carew to get a piece of marble and sculpt the imperial eagle of Napoleon and put it up over the door of the manor house in Lisduggan. And on that then was the imperial eagle of Napoleon Bonaparte and the words Laetitia Bonaparte Wyse. And basically it was the last nail in the coffin as far as she was concerned. She had gotten them. She had gotten the land for her children. And when she died herself, she was brought back she was in Italy, and the family, they really didn't like their father at all. And the family decided to build a monument in a place called Viterbo in Italy, where she was born. It's called a monument to motherhood.
Wow.
They absolutely idolised her for all her scandals and all her affairs. The family idolised her, and they really despised her poor father.
Oh my God! It didn't make a great movie.
I tell you now.
Oh, it does, yeah.
Eamon, as you say, it's a mighty interesting story, but we have to leave it there for the minute. We're just smack out of time. But listen, we really appreciate you giving us another chapter of Waterford Treasures.
Talk to you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.